Case 1. Josephine Verellen and Jacqueline Verellen. A social worker arrived at a home in Macomb County, Michigan, on a routine child welfare appointment. She never returned. And because of what happened to her that afternoon, the state of Michigan rewrote its laws. This is the documented case of Josephine Verellen and Jacqueline Verellen, two biological sisters whose actions on May 20th, 1998, resulted in the death of a county caseworker, 2 murder convictions, and a landmark piece of Michigan legislation that still protects government workers today. Let us walk through exactly what the court record shows. Lisa Putman was 28 years old and worked as a Child Protective Services caseworker for the Macomb County Family Independence Agency. She had been assigned to the Verellen household after a complaint was filed regarding the condition of the home. 8 days before she was killed, Lisa had become engaged to be married. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and thorough. Josephine Verellen was 28 years old and the mother of 2 children, ages 7 and 8. Her younger biological sister, Jacqueline Verellen, was 22 and lived with her in a home near Washington Township in Macomb County. According to law enforcement testimony, Macomb County Sheriff Sergeant John Michael described the residence as filled with animal feces, urine, garbage, and flies. The home contained 6 cats and 1 dog. The plumbing had failed, and the occupants were using buckets. Garbage had accumulated throughout the interior. The home had been flagged repeatedly by Child Protective Services. Authorities noted that Lisa Putman had, at various points, personally assisted the sisters in cleaning the home. Family members had also helped. The home repeatedly returned to the same condition. Lisa Putman's last confirmed appointment was at the Verellen home at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on May 20th, 1998. She did not return to her office. Her fiancé and mother reported her missing that evening. When law enforcement contacted all of Lisa's scheduled clients and identified the Verellen home as her final stop, investigators arrived to conduct a welfare check. The home's condition matched prior reports. Both sisters were taken in for questioning. Court records document that Josephine Verellen confessed during interrogation. She told investigators that when Lisa arrived that afternoon, both sisters demanded to know who had filed the complaint against them. Lisa refused to disclose the identity of the complainant, which was required by law. According to Josephine's statement, both sisters participated in an attack that resulted in Lisa's death. Josephine stated that Jacqueline had wielded a hammer during the assault. Jacqueline was subsequently questioned and admitted striking Lisa, but claimed it was only once. The medical examiner's findings directly contradicted that claim. Macomb County Medical Examiner Werner Spitz conducted the autopsy. His findings confirmed that Lisa Putman died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. The hammer recovered by investigators showed evidence consistent with the attack. The medical examiner documented injuries consistent with 22 individual impacts. Lisa's body had been placed in garbage bags and left in the bathtub inside the Verellen home. The sisters then retrieved the children from school and went shopping. Later, they transported the remains to a wooded area in Addison Township, Oakland County, where the body was deposited. Lisa's vehicle, a 1998 Oldsmobile Cutlass, was abandoned at a Rite Aid pharmacy several miles from the home. A missing persons report was filed the evening of May 20th. Detectives systematically contacted every client on Lisa's schedule and identified the Verellen home as her final appointment. The abandoned vehicle was located through witness information and surveillance review. After Josephine's confession, one of the sisters directed investigators to the location where Lisa's body had been left. Remains were recovered approximately 2 days after the initial disappearance report. Both sisters were initially charged with first-degree murder. They were held without bond. Judge Joseph Bedecker presided over arraignment proceedings. Both Josephine and Jacqueline subsequently entered guilty pleas to second-degree murder and kidnapping. Josephine Verellen was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison, with a maximum of 75 years. Under those terms, she would not be eligible for parole consideration until approximately 2048. Jacqueline Verellen received a sentence of a minimum of 25 years, maximum 50 years. The sentencing disparity reflected Josephine's role as the parent of the children at the center of the case and her greater degree of culpability as established by the court record. As of the most recent available public records, Josephine Verellen, Michigan Department of Corrections, number 272423, remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Pittsfield Charter Township. Parole eligibility is approximately 2,039 based on her sentence structure. Jacqueline Verellen, MDOC number 2739990, was granted parole in April 2022 after serving approximately 24 years. She is under Michigan Department of Corrections supervision. The death of Lisa Putman had direct consequences for Michigan law. In 2001, the Michigan legislature passed Public Act 22, which created Michigan Compiled Law Section 750.81c, commonly known as Lisa's Law. The statute established criminal penalties specifically for threatening, assaulting, or causing serious bodily injury to Family Independence Agency workers, later extended to all Michigan Department of Health and Human Services employees, because of their official duties. Under Lisa's Law, threatening an MDHHS employee is a misdemeanor carrying up to 1 year in prison or a $1,000 fine. Assaulting and causing physical injury to an MDHHS employee is a felony carrying up to 2 years. Causing serious bodily harm is a felony carrying up to 5 years. The law also mandated new safety protocols, including the Working Safe and Working Smart training program, and required caseworkers to request law enforcement assistance before entering situations identified as unsafe. In 2017, State Representative Henry Yanez of Sterling Heights introduced legislation to expand Lisa's Law to cover all in-home healthcare workers. Lisa's mother, Barbara Case, testified publicly in support of the expansion. The case was featured on Investigation Discovery's documentary program Twisted Sisters and has been covered by multiple podcasts including Sword and Scale and Malice in the Mitten. Because of Lisa Putman, Michigan social workers have legal protections they did not have before May 20, 1998. That is the court-documented record of Case 1. Case 2, Diane Marie Hart and Vicki Lynn Brill. On November 13, 2013, two sisters sat inside an undercover Michigan State Police officer's vehicle in a parking lot in Norton Shores, Michigan. They asked him to commit a murder. They handed over rings as a down payment. They specified where they wanted it done. And every word, every detail, was captured on recording equipment installed in that vehicle before they arrived. This is the documented case of Diane Marie Hart and Vicki Lynn Brill, sisters from Ravenna, Muskegon County, Michigan, who were arrested, tried, and convicted for solicitation of murder. Diane Marie Hart, born approximately 1968, was 45 years old at the time of her arrest. She was married to Gene Michael Hart, age 51. Vicki Lynn Brill, born January 4, 1963, was 50 years old. She was Diane's older biological sister. All three, Diane, Vicki, and Gene Hart, lived together on Klein Road in Ravenna, Muskegon County, Michigan. Diane and Gene had been married for 17 years. According to testimony and law enforcement records, Vicki Brill approached a relative of Gene Hart, identified as Dean Wilson, Diane's brother-in-law, and offered him money to kill Gene. Wilson dismissed the approach initially, but when Vicki set a specific timeline for the proposed killing, Wilson became alarmed. Gene Hart himself learned of the conversation and contacted Michigan State Police Detective Greg Polson on November 12, 2013. He told detectives he feared for his life. Michigan State Police coordinated with the West Michigan Enforcement Team, known as MET, to establish a sting operation. An undercover state trooper would pose as a hired killer. The meeting was arranged. On November 13, 2013, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, both sisters arrived at the Five Below store on Harvey Street in Norton Shores, near the Lakes Mall. They entered the undercover officer's vehicle. Before getting in, the sisters asked the undercover officer directly whether he was a law enforcement officer. He answered in the negative. The conversation that followed was recorded in its entirety. The sisters specified the location where they wanted the killing to take place, the garage of the home. Diane Hart said, "Because my grandson's in the house." When the undercover officer asked about the method, Diane Hart responded, "Whatever's easiest." The sisters provided a photograph of Gene Hart and offered jewelry as a down payment toward an agreed total payment. The entire exchange was documented by the recording equipment in the vehicle. Approximately 5 minutes after the meeting concluded, both sisters were stopped by Michigan State Police and placed under arrest. On the same morning, November 13, 2013, Diane Hart had filed for divorce from Jean Michael Hart. Both sisters were formally charged on November 15, 2013, with solicitation of murder, a charge carrying a maximum penalty of life in prison under Michigan law. Bond was set at $100,000 for each defendant. Diane Hart faced an additional designation as a four-time habitual offender based on prior convictions from 1986, which included burglary, breaking and entering, and receiving and concealing stolen property. Diane Marie Hart entered a no-contest plea on March 20, 2014. On April 28, 2014, Muskegon County 14th Circuit Chief Judge William C. Marietti sentenced Diane Hart to a minimum of 6 years and a maximum of 30 years in prison. Vicki Lynn Brill entered a no-contest plea on April 1, 2014. On June 17, 2014, she was sentenced to a minimum of 6 years and a maximum of 30 years in prison. At sentencing, each sister attributed primary responsibility to the other. Diane Hart addressed the court, stating, "Sorry for all the mess. I wish I wouldn't have gotten drug into it." Muskegon County Prosecutor D.J. Hilson responded on the record, "She participated in this fully. In my opinion, she's just as guilty as her sister." Appeals. Diane Hart filed an appeal of her sentence. The Michigan Court of Appeals found no valid basis for relief. The Michigan Supreme Court denied her appeal request on July 28, 2015. Vicki Lynn Brill was discharged from her sentence on November 13, 2020, and placed on probation. Court records subsequently reflect that Vicki Brill was charged with possession of controlled substance analogs, with the offense date listed as February 16, 2023. She was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison on September 20, 2024. She was discharged from that sentence on May 29, 2025. Muskegon County Prosecutor D.J. Hilson noted publicly that this was the second murder-for-hire case his office had prosecuted in a short period, the first being the widely covered Julia Murfeld case, also in Muskegon County. The recorded video of the transaction inside the undercover officer's vehicle was the central piece of evidence in both cases. Investigators and prosecutors pointed to this case as an example of how sting operations are able to document the full scope of a criminal conspiracy at the moment it is executed. The intended victim, Jean Michael Hart, survived. He was never harmed. The plot was intercepted entirely through the coordination between Jean Hart, Michigan State Police, and the West Michigan Enforcement Team before any harm occurred. That is the court-documented record of Case 2. Case 3. Caridad Gallart and Clara Gallart. Two sisters opened a medical clinic in Dearborn, Michigan. In just over 1 year, they submitted more than $9 million in fraudulent Medicare claims, collected more than $6 million in fraudulent payments, and then left the country. Federal agents tracked them across Panama, Venezuela, and Colombia before bringing them back to the United States in handcuffs. At the time, investigators described it as the largest international Medicare fraud bust on record. This is the documented federal case of Caridad Gallart and Clara Gallart. Caridad Gallart and her older biological sister Clara Gallart were both Cuban-born. They were 54 and 57 years old respectively at the time of sentencing. In approximately November 2005, both sisters opened the Dearborn Medical Rehabilitation Center, known as DMRC, in Dearborn, Wayne County, Michigan. According to federal court documents, the DMRC was established not as a functioning medical facility, but as an instrument of Medicare fraud. The clinic presented itself as an infusion center providing expensive medications to patients diagnosed with HIV and hepatitis C. In practice, the sisters purchased only approximately $36,000 in actual medication and medical supplies over the life of the scheme. They submitted claims totaling $9.1 million. Medicare paid out in excess of $6 million. Patients who visited DMRC did not require the infusion treatments being billed. They were recruited by intermediaries hired by the sisters, who paid cash kickbacks to patients in exchange for their Medicare information. The medications that appeared on billing documents were selected not based on clinical need, but based on which drugs generated the highest reimbursement rates from Medicare. The sisters hired a licensed physician to provide the appearance of medical legitimacy at the clinic. The proceeds generated through the fraudulent claims were laundered through a series of shell corporations with no legitimate business operations. The case was jointly investigated by the FBI Detroit Field Office and the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, operating as part of the Medicare Fraud Strike Force. The strike force was supervised by the Department of Justice Criminal Division's Fraud Section and the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Michigan. During the course of the investigation, FBI agents seized approximately $465,000 from bank accounts controlled by Caridad Gallart. More than 10 co-conspirators were identified, including clinic co-owners Martin Tasis and Joaquin Tasis, who subsequently pleaded guilty to related charges. CBS News' flagship news program and the CBS 4 investigative team conducted a joint investigation in November 2009 that contributed to public awareness of the case. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Michigan returned an indictment containing 11 counts against the sisters in June 2009. When the indictment was unsealed, investigators discovered that the sisters had already fled the United States. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General placed both Caridad and Clara Gallart on its most wanted healthcare fraud fugitives list. The sisters had traveled first to Panama and then to Venezuela. Both were located in Bogotá, Colombia. On March 13, 2011, approximately 21 months after the indictment, Colombian law enforcement authorities arrested both sisters in Bogotá. They were transported back to the United States the following day aboard Avianca Airlines Flight Number 8 from Bogotá. On August 24, 2011, both sisters entered guilty pleas before United States District Judge Cecilia M. Altanaga. The case had been transferred with the defendant's consent to the Southern District of Florida, where the judge was sitting. Each sister pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering. On November 3, 2011, both sisters were sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. Each received 3 years of supervised release to follow. Both were ordered to pay approximately $6 million in restitution jointly with co-defendants. Caridad Gallart forfeited the $465,000 seized from her accounts by the FBI. Legal and investigative significance. Federal prosecutors noted that the DMRC scheme had structural similarities to Medicare fraud operations previously prosecuted in South Florida, where the sisters had connections. The relocation of the scheme to Michigan was consistent with a documented pattern of fraud operators moving to jurisdictions with less established fraud detection infrastructure in order to extend the duration of their criminal activity. The sisters' placement on the HHSOIG Most Wanted list and their subsequent capture in Colombia demonstrated the reach of federal healthcare fraud enforcement beyond domestic borders. Investigators stated at the time that the international arrest represented the most significant fugitive recovery in the history of the HHSOIG Most Wanted program up to that point. The case was part of the federal government's Healthcare Fraud Prevention and Enforcement Action Team, known as the HEAT Initiative, which was established to coordinate Medicare and Medicaid fraud prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The Dearborn Medical Rehabilitation Center is no longer in operation. All licenses and Medicare billing authorizations were terminated as part of the prosecution. That is the court-documented record of Case 3. Case 4. Candy Juanita Lawson. Police arrived at a home in Corunna, Michigan, in July 2015 after a handyman reported what he had found during a repair visit. Behind a mattress leaned against a closet door, officers found a 42-year-old woman with cognitive and physical disabilities. She weighed 71 pounds. She had been there for approximately 6 to 7 years. The woman who had confined her was her adopted sister. This is the documented case of Candy Juanita Lawson, convicted in Shiawassee County Circuit Court of unlawful imprisonment, first-degree vulnerable adult abuse, and embezzlement from a vulnerable adult. Candy Juanita Lawson, age 44 at the time of her arrest, was a former tattoo parlor owner who had previously operated a business called Candy's Body Art in Frankfort, Kentucky. She had gained legal custody of 2 adopted disabled siblings, Diana Churchill and Christopher Justin Churchill, following the deaths of their parents. She later relocated to Oliver Street in Corunna, Shiawassee County, Michigan, where she was living at the time of her arrest. Diana Churchill, age 42 at the time of her discovery, had cognitive impairments, was deaf, and was partially blind. She was Lawson's adopted sister and a dependent adult under Lawson's legal care. Lawson received Diana's Social Security disability benefit payments as her designated representative payee. On July 8, 2015, a handyman named Robert Lamar was conducting repair work at Lawson's residence on Oliver Street in Corunna. During the course of that work, Lamar discovered a woman confined behind a closet door that had a full-sized mattress leaned against it from the exterior. He reported his discovery to authorities the following day. On July 9, 2015, Corunna police officers David Stone and Matthew Frey responded to the residence following Lamar's report. When officers arrived, Candy Lawson initially told them that no such person lived in the home. Officers conducted a search of the premises and located Diana Churchill. The closet space measured approximately 4 by 8 feet and had no light source. Diana had access only to a bucket for sanitary purposes and received minimal food and water. Diana Churchill was transported to Memorial Healthcare in Owasso. She received approximately 1 week of inpatient treatment for severe dehydration and malnutrition before being transferred to state protective custody. Corunna Police Chief Nick Kairos stated publicly, "I have been in police for 35 years and never seen an adult abuse case of that type." Court records established that during the years Diana was confined, Candy Lawson continued to receive Diana's Social Security disability benefit payments as representative payee. Prosecutors established that those funds were not used for Diana's care, housing, or sustenance in any appropriate manner. When Lawson's arrest became public, law enforcement in Franklin County, Kentucky, reviewed a prior case. In September 2009, Lawson's other adopted disabled sibling, Christopher Justin Churchill, age 37, had died in Frankfort, Kentucky, weighing 60 pounds. His cause of death had initially been recorded as natural causes. Following Lawson's Michigan arrest, Franklin County Coroner William Herod announced a formal review. The cause of death was subsequently revised. Lawson was investigated in connection with Justin Churchill's death, but was not charged. Lawson was charged in the 66th District Court before Judge Wardell Clarkson with 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, a 15-year felony, 1 count of first-degree vulnerable adult abuse, also a 15-year felony, and 1 count of embezzlement from a vulnerable adult, a 5-year felony. Bond was set at $50,000. She entered a not guilty plea. Trial proceedings were held in September 2017 in Shiawassee County Circuit Court, 35th Circuit. Prosecutor Deanna Finnegan called 30 witnesses. Testimony established that multiple individuals who had visited Lawson's home over the years were unaware that Diana Churchill lived there. Evidence showed that the home had been physically modified to make the space where Diana was confined less detectable. Lawson testified in her own defense and argued that the space was a room, not a closet, and that she locked her sister in at night to prevent her from wandering. The jury found Candy Lawson guilty on all 3 counts on September 25, 2017. On October 27, 2017, Judge Stewart of the 35th Circuit Court sentenced Lawson to 10 to 15 years for unlawful imprisonment and 40 to 60 months for embezzlement, ordered to run consecutively. The combined effective sentence was 13 1/3 to 20 years in prison. Lawson addressed the court and stated, "I'm not a bad person. I made some bad choices." Prosecutor Finnegan addressed the court at sentencing. Defense attorney Amy Husted filed a subsequent appeal on Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause grounds involving the use of evidence related to Justin Churchill's death. Court records available through the Michigan Court of Appeals, docket number 342213, reflect the appeal was reviewed. Reports following the sentencing indicated that Diana Churchill had gained approximately 50 pounds during her time in state protective care and was reportedly in a significantly improved state of health. This case exposed the absence of cross-state information sharing between adult protective services agencies. Despite a disabled individual dying under Lawson's care in Kentucky in 2009, no mechanism existed to flag Lawson as a high-risk caretaker when she relocated to Michigan with Diana. The case drew national media coverage from NBC News, Fox News, CBS Detroit, and the Associated Press, and contributed to broader policy discussions about oversight of disabled adults living under family caretaker arrangements. That is the court-documented record of Case 4. Case 5. Crystal Mikula and Cynthia Mikula. On April 19, 2001, a United Airlines flight carrying 233 people was diverted to Anchorage, Alaska, because of an incident involving two passengers. Those two passengers were identical twin sisters from Buckley, Michigan. One of them punched the captain in the head. The other put a flight attendant in a chokehold. And that was only the beginning of their documented criminal histories. Crystal Marie Mikula and Cynthia Mai Mikula were identical twins, born in approximately 1979, and raised in Buckley, Wexford County, Michigan. They were 22 years old at the time of the air incident. Crystal and Cynthia Mikula were booked as passengers on a United Airlines flight departing San Francisco International Airport bound for Shanghai. The aircraft was carrying 231 additional passengers and crew. Approximately 3 hours into the flight, following the consumption of multiple alcoholic beverages, both sisters began a disruptive incident that was partially captured on video by another passenger. That footage was subsequently broadcast on national news networks. According to federal court documents and law enforcement reports, the following was established. Cynthia Mikula struck a female flight attendant in the nose, struck a male flight attendant in the face, struck the captain of the aircraft in the head, spat on crew members, and attempted to open an aircraft door while the plane was at altitude. She was physically restrained on the floor using plastic handcuffs. Crystal Mikula then jumped onto the back of a flight attendant and applied a chokehold. Both sisters had also gone to the aircraft lavatory together, where cigarette smoke was detected. The flight crew declared the situation unmanageable and diverted the aircraft to Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport in Anchorage, Alaska. All 231 additional passengers were forced to disembark and spend the night in Anchorage. The flight to Shanghai was canceled. FBI Special Agent Eric Gonzalez led the federal investigation. Both sisters appeared before United States Magistrate John Roberts in Anchorage. Crystal Mikula entered a guilty plea to misdemeanor assault and received a sentence of 2 years of probation. Cynthia Mikula entered a guilty plea to the federal felony charge of interfering with a flight crew, which carries a statutory maximum of 20 years in federal prison. Subsequent criminal history in Michigan. Following the federal proceedings, both sisters returned to Michigan and accumulated documented criminal histories within the state. Cynthia Mikula was arrested in December 2010 in Wyoming, Michigan, in Kent County, and was arraigned in Wyoming District Court on 2 counts of controlled substance possession, including possession of heroin in an amount less than 25 grams. Crystal Mikula's documented Michigan criminal history includes a drug delivery felony conviction following her guilty plea to selling a controlled substance to an undercover law enforcement officer. She also accumulated multiple theft-related convictions. In 2012, Crystal Mikula was charged in Grand Traverse County with second-degree retail fraud involving theft from a Walmart store in Garfield Township. In the same year, she was charged with felony identity theft in Traverse City. Court records established that Crystal had obtained the Michigan driver's license belonging to her sister Angela Mikula, a third sibling, and used that license to impersonate Angela during approximately 17 separate visits to a physician's office between May and August of 2012, during which she obtained prescription medications using Angela's identity. Angela Mikula herself reported the theft to authorities after discovering the impersonation. The Traverse City Record Eagle documented Crystal Mikula's subsequent proceedings in Grand Traverse County and noted the continuing pattern of criminal conduct that followed the original 2001 federal case. The Mikula case is significant in the documented record for 3 reasons. First, it illustrates how a single federal criminal incident can reflect and predict longer patterns of criminal behavior across multiple jurisdictions. Second, it is one of the relatively rare documented instances in which one sister was identified as a crime victim in relation to the other. Angela Mikula's identity was stolen by Crystal Mikula, her biological sister. Third, the case spans 2 decades of documented criminal proceedings across federal court in Alaska and multiple Michigan counties including Wexford, Kent, and Grand Traverse. Crystal Mikula's identity theft charge against her own sister represents a distinct category of intrafamily crime. A sibling using another sibling's legal identity to evade detection and obtain controlled substances from medical providers. That conduct was identified, investigated, and prosecuted through the Grand Traverse County Court System. That is the court-documented record of Case 5. Case 6. Dejani Buckhannon and Danisha Buckhannon. On November 11, 2017, in the early hours of the morning, a 23-year-old woman named Charsha Dent Miller was injured during an altercation on Detroit's west side. She was left at the scene for approximately 3 hours. She was later removed from life support. 2 sisters were charged with second-degree murder. This is the documented case of Dejani Buckhannon and Danisha Buckhannon, charged in Wayne County, Michigan. The event occurred at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 2017, on the 8300 block of Sussex Street in Detroit, south of Joy Road and east of Greenfield, in Wayne County. According to court documents and Detroit Police Department statements, an altercation occurred between the victim, Charsha Dent Miller, age 23, and 3 individuals identified as Dejani Buckhannon, age 22, Danisha Buckhannon, age 28, and co-defendant Mario Tipton, age 26. During the altercation, Charsha Dent Miller sustained a significant head injury. She was left at the scene on the curb for approximately 3 hours before anyone contacted emergency services. When she was transported to a hospital, physicians determined the injury was not survivable. She was placed on life support so that her organs could be donated. She was subsequently removed from life support. Detroit Police Department statement. Detroit Police Chief James Craig addressed media following the charges. Chief Craig stated, "We think it is over some reference to the suspect's child." Beyond that statement, the Detroit Police Department did not publicly specify the precise role of each individual defendant in the altercation. Dejani Buckhannon was charged with second-degree murder and arraigned in June 2018. She was denied bond and ordered to have no firearms. Danisha Buckhannon was similarly charged with second-degree murder and denied bond. Mario Tipton was charged with second-degree murder. He was arraigned on June 20, 2018, and denied bond. A probable cause conference was scheduled for June 27 and a preliminary examination for July 3, 2018, before Third Circuit Court Judge William McConnico. Detroit police investigators identified all 3 suspects through witness statements and physical evidence collected at the scene. The murder weapon identified in press reports was a 2x4 piece of lumber recovered during the investigation. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office filed second-degree murder charges against all 3 defendants based on the investigation's findings. Despite extensive review of Michigan court records, Wayne County court databases, and the Michigan Department of Corrections Offender Tracking Information System, no final disposition, including trial verdict, plea agreement terms, or sentencing record, was identified in publicly accessible records for either Dejani or Danisha Buckhannon in connection with this case. A 2021 Michigan Court of Appeals civil docket listing, case number 354801, reflects the name Dejani Buckhannon in what appears to be a separate civil or custody proceeding, which may indicate that the criminal case was resolved prior to that date through means not reflected in publicly accessible press coverage. Researchers and documentary producers requiring confirmed disposition information should access the Wayne County Third Circuit Court's Odyssey Public Access portal or submit a formal public records request to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. The Buckhannon case represents a category of sister criminal involvement that differs from the conspiracy cases covered earlier in this documentary. Here, 2 sisters are documented as co-defendants in a homicide charge arising from a single incident rather than a coordinated planned scheme. The court record addresses their individual accountability within that single event. The death of Charsha Dent Miller at the age of 23 and the 3-hour period during which she remained at the scene without emergency services being called were identified by the Detroit Police Department as central facts of the investigation. That is the court-documented record of Case 6. Case 7. Letitia Higgins and Bianca Harvey. 2 sisters in Macomb County, Michigan, called police on each other. That call escalated into a vehicle chase, 2 felony arrests, and an assault on law enforcement officers, all documented within approximately 45 minutes on a November afternoon in 2022. This is the documented case of Letitia Yvonne Higgins and Bianca A.C. Harvey, charged in Warren, Macomb County, Michigan. At just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon on November 16, 2022, Letitia Yvonne Higgins, age 36, of Warren, contacted Warren Police Department from her vehicle, a Jaguar, and reported that her sister, Bianca A.C. Harvey, age 31, of Sterling Heights, was pursuing her in a Jeep near the intersection of 10 Mile Road and Shaner Road in Warren, Macomb County. Higgins told dispatch that Harvey had fired shots at her vehicle. Investigators and witnesses who were at the scene at the time disputed the shooting allegation. No ballistic evidence of discharged firearms was recovered at the scene. Witness accounts indicated that Higgins had thrown an object at Harvey's Jeep. Warren police officers attempted to conduct a traffic stop of Letitia Higgins' Jaguar approximately 1.5 miles south of the original location. Higgins declined to stop and continued driving. Officers pursued her for a distance of less than 1 mile before she stopped her vehicle in the city of Detroit. Officers began placing Higgins under arrest for felony fleeing and eluding. At that point, Bianca Harvey's Jeep arrived at the location. Harvey exited her vehicle and physically assaulted both Higgins and the Warren police officers who were conducting the arrest. Both sisters were taken into custody at that location. Bianca A.C. Harvey was arraigned on November 17, 2022, on the following charges: felony resisting or obstructing a police officer and misdemeanor domestic violence. She was released on a bond of $5,000. Letitia Yvonne Higgins was arraigned on November 17, 2022, on the following charges: felony resisting or obstructing a police officer, misdemeanor domestic violence, and third-degree felony fleeing and eluding. She was released on a bond of $10,000. Both defendants were scheduled for a probable cause conference hearing on December 1, 2022. Official law enforcement statements. Warren Police Commissioner Bill Dwyer provided a statement to the media following the arraignments. This incident involved an argument between two female family members known to each other. Thankfully, there were no shots fired during this incident. Commissioner Dwyer separately expressed concern regarding the bond amounts set by the presiding judge, stating, "I am disappointed that a visiting judge issued a personal bond for two individuals charged with felonies. This is another disappointment to law enforcement officers who go out every day to protect the public." Media coverage. The case was covered by Click on Detroit, the Detroit News, MLive, iHeartRadio's Detroit affiliate, and The Blaze. Multiple national outlets picked up the story based on the unusual circumstance of two sisters simultaneously calling police on each other while both engaging in criminal conduct. The Higgins-Harvey case is documented here not because it involved long-term criminal planning, but because it demonstrates how a sibling dispute, a reported argument between biological sisters, can escalate rapidly into serious criminal conduct involving assaults on law enforcement officers and felony-level charges. The charging documents established that both sisters were ultimately identified by investigators as perpetrators rather than as victims in the legal sense, despite both having contacted or been in contact with police. The false report of a shooting, which was not supported by physical evidence, added a separate dimension to the criminal conduct documented in this case. The final disposition of charges filed against both Letitia Higgins and Bianca Harvey was not available in publicly accessible court records reviewed for this documentary. Confirmed outcome information can be accessed through the Macomb County Circuit Court's public records system. That is the court-documented record of Case 7. Case 8. Nikita Washington and Jamela Washington. Between October 2009 and April 2012, more than 100 people in Michigan had their personal information stolen without their knowledge. That stolen information was used to submit fraudulent claims to the Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency. The total amount taken exceeded $400,000. Federal prosecutors identified the operation as a coordinated identity theft and unemployment fraud ring. Two of the individuals convicted after a 5-day jury trial were Nikita Washington and Jamela Washington, both from Warren, Macomb County. This is the documented federal case prosecuted in the Eastern District of Michigan. According to the federal indictment returned by a grand jury in October 2012, the defendants obtained personally identifiable information belonging to more than 100 individuals who were not aware their information was being used. That information was entered into the Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency's online claims system to generate fraudulent unemployment compensation payments. The scheme operated from October 2009 through April 2012, a period of approximately 30 months. The October 2012 federal grand jury indictment named 8 defendants. 5 carried the surname Washington. Nikita Washington, age approximately 24 at the time of indictment, of Warren. Jamela Washington, age approximately 22, also of Warren. Darius Washington, age approximately 27, of Warren. Shalace Washington, age approximately 27, of Detroit. And Rufus Washington, age approximately 24, of Detroit. Additional co-defendants included Kenneth Dixon, Carl Leslie, and Charles Durr. For the purposes of this documentary, Nikita Washington and Jamela Washington are identified as biological sisters based on their shared surname, shared city of residence of Warren, close ages, and joint participation in the charged conspiracy. Confirmation of the specific family relationship is available through Eastern District of Michigan court records. The 5 other defendants reached separate resolutions with prosecutors and did not proceed to trial. Only Nikita Washington, Jamela Washington, and Kenneth Dixon proceeded to the jury trial phase of the case. The trial. The 5-day jury trial was held in Ann Arbor before the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. The case was prosecuted by Assistant United States Attorney C. Barrington Wilkins. All 3 trial defendants, Nikita Washington, Jamela Washington, and Kenneth Dixon, were convicted on all counts submitted to the jury. The jury returned verdicts of guilty on all submitted counts, which included use of counterfeit access devices, aggravated identity theft, theft of government money, and conspiracy to commit each of those offenses. The verdict was announced on May 22, 2017. Sentencing for all 3 convicted defendants was scheduled for September 19, 2017. Each of the primary charges carried a statutory maximum of 10 years in federal prison. The aggravated identity theft count carried a mandatory 2-year consecutive sentence under federal law. The investigation was conducted by the Department of Labor Office of Inspector General, with the case announcement credited to Special Agent in Charge James Vanderberg of the Detroit Field Office. The Michigan Talent Investment Agency, whose director was Wanda Stokes, provided investigative assistance. The case was announced publicly by Acting United States Attorney Daniel L. Lemish. Federal investigators used claims data from the Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency to identify patterns of fraudulent submissions. When multiple claims were traced to the same originating source using different identities, the pattern identified a coordinated ring rather than isolated instances of fraud. Investigators traced the submission activity to the identified defendants using electronic records, financial transaction data, and communication records. The use of victims' personal identifying information to generate online unemployment claims is a form of aggravated identity theft specifically because it exploits the victim's legal identity to obtain government benefits, a federal crime distinct from ordinary identity theft because it involves misappropriation of funds from a federal benefit program. This case demonstrates the federal government's capacity to prosecute identity theft rings that target state-administered federal benefit programs. The Michigan Unemployment Insurance Agency, which administers a program funded in part by federal dollars, is within the jurisdiction of federal fraud statutes when its systems are exploited through identity theft. The case also illustrates the scale achievable by a coordinated ring operating through online systems. More than 100 individual identities compromised over 30 months, with more than $400,000 in fraudulent payments extracted before the scheme was identified and stopped. That is the court-documented record of Case 8. Case 9. Brittany, Indonesia Ivory. Officers responding to a residence in Waterford Township, Oakland County, on a September evening in 2024 found 2 people who could not free themselves. One was a 4-year-old child, strapped to a stroller inside a bedroom. The other was a 32-year-old woman with developmental disabilities, bound with duct tape in the backyard. The person responsible for both of them was the 32-year-old woman's adopted sister and the child's mother. This is the documented case of Brittany, Indonesia Ivory, charged in Oakland County, Michigan. Brittany, Indonesia Ivory, age 31, resided in Waterford Township, Oakland County, Michigan. She served as the designated caretaker for her 32-year-old adopted sister, who has not been publicly identified by name in court or law enforcement records reviewed for this documentary. Ivory also had a 4-year-old daughter living in the home. On Saturday evening, September 21, 2024, Waterford Township Police Department officers responded to Ivory's residence. Upon arriving, officers located Ivory's adopted sister, age 32, with documented developmental disabilities, bound with duct tape in the backyard of the property. Ivory was not present at the home. Officers conducted a search of the interior of the residence. Inside a bedroom, they found Ivory's 4-year-old daughter secured to a stroller. The child was unable to free herself. Both individuals, the adult sister and the 4-year-old child, were transported to a local medical facility for evaluation and treatment. Brittany Ivory was arraigned on September 24, 2024, before the 51st District Court in Waterford Township. The charges filed by Oakland County prosecutors were as follows: 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment, a 15-year felony for each count, 1 count of second-degree child abuse, and 1 count of third-degree vulnerable adult abuse. Bond was set at $10,000, cash or surety. A probable cause conference was scheduled for October 1, 2024, at 2:30 in the afternoon. Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald issued a public statement following Ivory's arraignment. Prosecutor McDonald stated, "Caretakers are entrusted to support and protect the safety of individuals in their care. To use your position of trust to abuse another individual, in this case, a child and a vulnerable adult, is abhorrent. Under Michigan law, unlawful imprisonment, MCL 750.349b, is a 15-year felony that applies when a person knowingly restrains another person to interfere substantially with that person's liberty. The application of this statute to both the adult disabled sister and the 4-year-old child established 2 separate felony counts. Second-degree child abuse, MCL 750.136, applies when a person's omission or reckless act causes serious physical harm to a child. Third-degree vulnerable adult abuse, MCL 750.145N, applies to a caretaker who recklessly causes physical harm to a vulnerable adult. The combination of charges in this case reflects the dual role Ivory occupied. She was both the designated caretaker for her adult disabled sister and the legal parent of the 4-year-old child. Both relationships created legal duties of care, and the prosecution established that both were violated on the same evening. This case is the second documented in this series, following the case of Candy Lawson in Case 4, in which a Michigan woman was charged with criminal offenses for the mistreatment of a disabled adult sibling for whom she held caretaker responsibility. Both cases involve the restraint or confinement of a disabled individual in a private residence by a family member who controlled the living situation. Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald and advocacy organizations covering the case noted that the incident raised questions about oversight mechanisms for individuals with developmental disabilities living under family caretaker arrangements. When a vulnerable adult is entirely dependent on a family member for housing, nutrition, and daily care, their access to outside reporting or intervention is limited to third-party discovery, as occurred in the Lawson case when a handyman discovered Diana Churchill, and in the Ivory case when responding officers conducted a search of the premises. Final disposition information for Brittany Ivory's case was not available in publicly accessible records at the time this documentary was compiled, as the case remained in early proceedings as of late 2024. Updated case status may be accessed through the Oakland County Circuit Court Public Records System. That is the court-documented record of Case 9. Case 10, the Gillart Network, extended analysis of the $9 million Medicare fraud operation. Because the scale of the Gillart sisters' documented criminal operation warrants additional examination, and because the research conducted for this documentary identified this case as the most extensively documented federal prosecution involving sisters in Michigan history, Case 10 presents an extended legal and investigative analysis of the full scope of what federal prosecutors documented in this case. While Caridad and Clara Gillart were the principals identified in the indictment as owners and operators of the Dearborn Medical Rehabilitation Center, federal prosecution documents identify a network of individuals who facilitated the scheme. Martin Tasis and Joaquin Tasis were identified as co-owners of the DMRC who entered guilty pleas to related fraud charges. The licensed physician employed at the clinic, whose name was not featured prominently in publicly released press materials, provided the medical credential documentation used to legitimize Medicare billing submissions. Investigators identified the physician's role as providing regulatory cover for a billing operation that had no genuine clinical basis. Patient recruiters, individuals hired and paid by the sisters, were identified in federal documents as having approached Medicare beneficiaries in community settings and offered cash payments in exchange for their Medicare numbers and willingness to appear at the DMRC for treatment sessions. The sessions recorded in billing documentation did not correspond to clinical need. Medications appearing on billing claims were selected based on reimbursement value rather than any determination of patient need. Federal prosecutors presented the following financial picture at sentencing. The DMRC submitted Medicare claims totaling $9.1 million between approximately November 2005 and March 2007, a period of approximately 16 months. Of that amount, Medicare paid in excess of $6 million before the scheme was identified. The sisters purchased approximately $36,000 in actual medications and medical supplies during the operation. The gap between actual expenditure on medical supplies, $36,000, and fraudulent billing, $9,100,000, represents the operational scope of the fraud. Proceeds were distributed through a network of shell corporations, legal entities established with no genuine business activity, whose purpose was to move money from Medicare payments into accounts controlled by the sisters and their associates in a manner designed to complicate financial investigation. The FBI Detroit field office led the financial investigation. Agents identified the Shell Corporation network through analysis of banking records subpoenaed during the investigation. The seizure of approximately $465,000 from Caridad Gallart's accounts, executed prior to the sisters' departure from the United States, preserved those funds for eventual forfeiture. The Medicare Fraud Strike Force used data analytics developed specifically to identify billing patterns that indicate fraudulent operations. Medicare claims submitted by a single provider within a short time window for a narrow category of expensive infusion medications, particularly HIV and hepatitis C treatments, generated the anomaly alerts that directed investigators to the DMRC. Federal investigators were able to establish that the sisters traveled from the United States to Panama and then to Venezuela following the unsealing of their indictment. Their identification in Colombia and arrest by Colombian law enforcement authorities required coordination between the HHS Office of Inspector General, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, and Colombian law enforcement agencies, specifically the Dirección de Investigación Criminal Interpol, known as DGIN. At the time of the sisters' capture and return in March 2011, federal officials stated publicly that the operation represented the most significant international fugitive recovery in the history of the HHSOIG healthcare fraud most wanted program. The Gallart sisters had been listed alongside other healthcare fraud fugitives who had fled to various countries, and their capture was identified as a demonstration that the program's international coordination capabilities had matured significantly. United States District Judge Cecilia M. Altanaga sentenced both sisters on November 3, 2011, in Miami, Florida. Each received 14 years in federal prison. Each received 3 years of supervised release to follow the prison term. The joint restitution obligation of approximately $6 million was established to repay the Medicare program for amounts fraudulently collected. The forfeiture of $465,000 by Caridad Gallart represented funds seized before the sisters left the country. Additional restitution was addressed through the sentencing order. The sentences imposed, 14 years each, placed the Gallart sisters among the more severely sentenced healthcare fraud defendants in Eastern District of Michigan history, reflecting both the scale of the fraud and the aggravating factor of international flight. The Healthcare Fraud Prevention and Enforcement Action Team, HEAT, was established in 2009 by the United States Attorney General and the Secretary of Health and Human Services specifically to coordinate Medicare and Medicaid fraud prosecutions. The Gallart case was among the early major prosecutions conducted under the HEAT framework. The Medicare Fraud Strike Force, which provided the data analytics and investigative infrastructure for the DMRC case, has since expanded to operate in multiple cities where Medicare fraud patterns have been identified, including Detroit, Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, in New York. The documented displacement of fraud operations from South Florida to Michigan, which federal prosecutors cited as a pattern in this and similar cases, has informed the strike force's national expansion. By establishing strike force operations in multiple cities simultaneously, federal enforcement officials aim to eliminate the ability of fraud operators to simply relocate to reduce detection risk. The DMRC case closed with both sisters incarcerated, all clinic operations terminated, and Medicare billing authorization permanently revoked. That is the extended court-documented record of Case 10.